So without further ado, our first speaker today is Neil Martin.
Hello, everybody.
He'll be presenting Updating macOS, Nudge in the Right Direction. So Neil, thank you for joining us. Please go ahead and share your slides.
Okay, so you should see something appearing now.
Fantastic. Looks great. All right, take it away, Neil. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much, Rusty. Thank you very much for having me tonight. So, hey everybody, I'm Neil and I'm a systems engineer at DataJar. And before I start, there's no need to take notes, but you can grab a copy of the slides at this link and I'll be posting the video up on my blog as soon as it's available. So today, we're going to dive into the somewhat murky and mysterious world of how to handle software updates for macOS itself. And something in the title might just give you a hint as to where we may end up. So we all know that Apple release updates for macOS, and we all know that it's really important that they're installed on our fleets to fix bugs and protect us against all the latest security vulnerabilities. So really, a timely patching schedule should be a cornerstone of your organization's information security posture. So let's explore some of the options that Apple give us. So it's reasonable to assume that we'd use our management tools to install software updates. And if you've been doing this for a while, you're probably familiar with the software update command. And some management tools have built-in support for it. We could also trigger it with a script. Now, if you've been using that command in recent years, especially on newer Intel Macs with the T2 chip or Apple Silicon Macs, you may have noticed that it's not quite as reliable as it used to be. And you may also have noticed that depending on the updates it installs, it might need an actual shutdown or restart afterwards to properly install them. With Silicon Macs, we're starting to see prompts for user authentication if we call software update from a script using our management tools. And that's because of changes around the new thing, volume ownership, which is a new concept that came along with Apple Silicon. And we also used to use software update to ignore specific updates we didn't want to install, but Apple have deprecated that option with macOS Big Sur. So really, because of these challenges, software update has started to fall out of favor with the admin community, and folks are really seeking out alternative workflows. So as for Apple, they're steering us towards some newer options. One of them is we can push an MDM configuration profile to our Macs that essentially ticks all of those boxes in software updates system preferences pane, which will enable automatic download and installation for updates. And this is basically an autopilot switch, and it puts the Macs themselves in charge of how and when they'll install those updates. Alternatively, we could send MDM commands to tell macOS to automatically check for and install updates there and then. Both of these options also let you add an optional deferral, which lets you delay updates being visible to your Macs until a set number of days after Apple release them. So, looking at the MDM profile option first, let's turn our attention to the com.apple.softwareupdate preference domain. And on the left, we have the contents of a property list for that domain. This represents all the settings we've configured for the Apple Software Update framework in raw XML as key and value pairs. On the right-hand side, we've got a screenshot from a popular MDM of a GUI configuration profile payload that configures the same settings. So, setting those highlighted options will essentially force macOS to check for, download and install any available updates as soon as possible. Updates that don't require a reboot will install automatically in the background. Users can also still update through system preferences and the software update pane if they want to. But for updates that do require a reboot, users will receive a notification to install, but they can dismiss it. So if they leave their Macs idle, macOS will try and log them out to install updates in quotes overnight. Don't have any more information than that. And if the user is running any apps that prevent a logout, say Microsoft Word with a document open and unsaved, that will actually stop the process. We also have this option, which takes care of things such as Gatekeeper, Xprotect, malicious software removal tool definitions. These should all install silently in the background when they're available too. So now let's take a closer look at updating macOS using MDM commands. We'll pick a typical MDM service. For example, here I'm using Jamf. And first of all, Jamf would normally send a schedule OS update scan command, which pretty much says, wait, go and check for updates now. And if you look at the Apple developer documentation for this command, it gets quite interesting because there is a force option for this command, which if you set to true, will start the scan immediately. If the option's set to false or it's not set by your MDM, the scan starts at, and I quote, a system determined time. And so if schedule OS update scan goes through successfully, the MDM sends the next command, available OS updates, essentially to ask the Mac to tell it what it found. The Mac sends back an array of dictionaries, comprises a list of available updates. And finally, the MDM sends a new command, schedule OS update, along with that array of dictionaries that it received and some other options, which tells the Mac to download or install those updates. So looking at the schedule OS update command in more detail, it has some options, quite a few options. So for each of the updates that it's going to list, the MDM server gets to specify an install action. And you can see that there are quite a few things it can do. There's also a warning in Apple's documentation for the last option, install force restart, that says it may result in data loss, because that's essentially telling the Mac to reboot straight away, irrespective of what your user may be up to. It's up to your MDM vendor to implement as much or as little as this as they choose. So using Jamf as an example, you've got the two choices in Jamf, one of which is download only, where it will use the install action options, download only or notify only, depending on the installed version of macOS. Or you've got the option to install and restart, where Jamf will use the install action options default or install ASAP, which again depends on the installed version of macOS on your clients. So as well as all of that, you've got a few more things to think about. MDM software update commands only work for supervised Macs or Macs that you've enrolled through automated device enrollment. Up until, I believe it was macOS 11.3, updates wouldn't install in at the login window, but this has reportedly been fixed. And for Apple Silicon, your users are going to be prompted for their password to install updates, unless your MDM has escrowed the Mac's bootstrap token and you've enabled the boot security policy option on Silicon to allow remote management of kernel extensions and automatic software updates, which you can turn on with Startup Security utility in Recovery OS, or you have your MDM do it by enrolling your Macs through Automated Device Enrollment, or DEP. Okay, moving on to deferrals. So sometimes you may need to delay macOS updates. For example, if you've got third-party apps or integrations that you need to test and validate those updates for first. Apple provide a couple of preference keys to manage this. First one, force delayed software updates, which enables deferrals, and managed deferred install delay, which you set to specify the number of days updates will be deferred for, and that's up to a maximum of 90 days. So when you set a deferral, updates are only visible to macOS after Apple released them and that number of days has passed. So with macOS Big Sur, Apple added another option, which is force delayed app software updates. And this defers updates for App Store apps that you distribute through managed distribution or VPP. You can most often find the deferral setting in the restrictions profile payload inside your MDM. Now, I'm not going to go any further with this, but if you want to go deeper into the rabbit hole, you should really check out Alan Sew's excellent article here, where he's actually documented these workflows and tested them in the real world, and he posts his results, which are quite interesting. And with all that, it's time to turn our attention to Nudge. So Nudge, what is it? Nudge is a user-level app, and it's written by the wonderful Eric Gomez. It essentially tells people to update their Macs with a rather large dialog that guides them to the system preferences software update pane. And by doing this, we can make sure that updates are installed in a more native and Apple approved way. And we can be quite a bit more persuasive with Nudge than using Apple's built-in methods, but we don't have the risks associated with installing updates automatically with our MDM servers or software update command. And as we'll see, Nudge is extremely configurable, and you can customize its behavior based on your needs, or as we like to put it, how annoying you want to be. So you can download Nudge from its GitHub repository, and in there you'll find the application itself, which is written in Swift and only runs on macOS 11 Big Sur and above. You've got the launch agent, which is optional, and which by default this will open Nudge at login and then 0 and 30 minutes past each hour. We have an optional logger, which is a launch daemon, and it captures Nudge's log output to a file, so you can sort of debug it or just check on what it's up to, make sure it's working. And finally, we've got the preferences that we need. These can be either in the form of an MDM configuration profile or a JSON file that you can point Nudge to when you launch it. And if you go for the JSON option, you can store that file locally on your Mac or host it on a remote web server. For my examples, I'll be using an MDM profile. So we've got a few things to prepare before we let this tool loose. I'm not going to cover every single feature or preference, but I will go over the most important ones. So first of all, we'll need to edit some preferences. Again, I'll be using an MDM configuration profile. And if that's the approach you're going to go for, I'd really recommend downloading the example profile that I've linked at the top of this slide, because it gives you a good starting point that you can customize from. Okay, so hopefully you should see a nice VM here. And I have the profile up here. I'm going to open it up. And first, so I'm going to look at the OS version requirements array here, which starts on line 31. First thing I'm going to set is this commented out section, which is the about update URL. The about update URL enables a more info button inside Nudge, which when a user clicks it, it will open that URL. I'm going to remove this anchor here. And by default, this points to Apple's KB article on the macOS Big Sur release notes. You could easily have this point to an internal intranet page or like your own resource if you want to. Okay, moving down. We're going to look at the required installation date. This tells Nudge the deadline for updates to be installed by. And as we approach this date and eventually pass it, Nudge's behavior will change to be more aggressive. Let's set that to, I'm looking at the date on my watch, say the 10th of June. Next option we have to set is the required minimum OS version. And this tells Nudge the lowest OS version we need our Macs to be on to be compliant. If the Macs are on or above that version, then Nudge won't display. So I'll set this to 11.4. And finally, we have the targeted OS versions array. This tells Nudge which versions of macOS it considers as requiring an update. So if the OS version on the Mac is not in this list, Nudge won't do anything. It won't display. So could add a few more here. Say 11.2.1, 11.3, 11.3.1, for example. We'll save this profile and we'll install it. Okay, and it's installed. So now we've got things up. Now we've got things set up. We can think about loading Nudge and having a little play with it. When you're testing, I'd recommend not installing the launch agent, so it launches randomly, but instead telling Nudge, running Nudge directly from the terminal, so you can easily quit it and reload it as you tweak preferences, just to see how things change and look. Before we get into it, we really need to understand that Nudge has essentially 5 stages or levels as we get closer to and we pass the required installation date. And you could say they're a little bit like the DEFCON system. So we'll say DEFCON 5, for example, and Nudge is inactive. In this state, it won't display a window. And the condition for this is that the installed version of macOS is greater than or equal to the required minimum OS version preference, or the installed version of macOS is not listed in the targeted OS versions array. Okay, and next stage, DEFCON 4, Nudge is at its initial stage. These conditions here are that the installed version of macOS is less than the required minimum OS version preference, and that the installed OS is listed in the targeted OS versions, and the number of hours before we reach the required installation date is greater than that set in a preference called approaching time window. And by default, that's 72 hours. So we're 72 hours away from our required installation date or more. Nudge in this state will refresh itself, bringing its window back into focus, and it will increment something called its deferral rate, which I'll elaborate further on in a minute. And it does this based on the number of seconds set in another preference called initial refresh cycle. At this stage, Nudge will display a window with a single primary quit button. I think we need to see what that looks like, don't we? So let's launch Nudge. And there we go. I'm not sure how well you can see this, but I'll point out all the differences, all the things in the UI. So essentially we have some elements here. We have this question mark at the top left in the window. If I click on that, I get some additional device information. I have this more info button. If I click on that, it will open a web browser showing the web page that I set in the preference earlier. We have an update device button. This will open system preferences, and it should take us to the software update preference pane like it is now. And then we also have this quit button here that says later, and if I click this, Nudge will close and quit and won't be running anymore. It's important to note that you can't move the window, so a user couldn't just drag the window to the corner of the screen, but other windows can still focus until Nudge refreshes. So I'll click later, say no thank you. Okay, so now things are starting to heat up a little bit as we reach DEFCON 3 or Nudge's approaching stage. And this will happen when the installed version of macOS, again, is less than the required minimum OS version, and the number of hours before we reach the required installation date is less than what we've set in the approaching window time preference. So by default, we've just crossed that 72-hour barrier. In this state, we'll see a window that has 2 quit buttons, and it will refresh and increment the deferral count based on the number of seconds set in a different preference called the approaching refresh cycle preference. And we'll just have a quick look at what that looks like. So I'm going to open up the profile again. And I'm going to set the required installation date. This opens to to 2 days in the future, so we can say the 5th of June. And then let's reinstall the profile again. Okay, there we go. And let's run nudge now to see if anything's changed. And you can see the window looks the same as before. We can see in the left-hand side where we see the required OS version and our current OS version, the days remaining to update, it has a number next to it, it says 2 now, so we're 2 days away. And we have this button here that doesn't say later, it says I understand. So I'll click that, and then I have a button that says later. So this is really making the user think a little bit more about updating, and maybe their organization wants them to update pretty soon. Okay, DEFCON 2, things are getting quite serious now. Nudge is now at its imminent stage. So the installed version of macOS again is less than the required minimum OS version preference. The number of hours before we reach the required installation date is now less than what's set in the imminent window time preference, which is 24 hours by default. So here the user experience is similar to the approaching stage. We'll see the same window with the 2 quit buttons, but Nudge will refresh and increment its deferral count based on the number of seconds you set in the imminent refresh cycle preference. So you can make Nudge refresh more aggressively here as we get closer and closer to the required installation date. And now it's really time to blow something up because we're at DEFCON 1. We've reached the elapsed stage. So same requirements as before with regards to the version of macOS and the required installation date. But this window here will have no quit buttons, and it will refresh and increment its deferral count based on the number of seconds set in the elapsed refresh cycle preference. And I think we have to see what this looks like. So let's go into that profile. Let's set the required installation date to the 1st of June. And we'll reinstall the profile. And we'll run Nudge again. And you can see now it's really difficult to get rid of Nudge. There is essentially no easy way to quit it. There are no quit buttons. So it's going to be there. And it will pop up again every time Nudge refreshes, just to remind users that they really need to update now. Of course, I'm running it from the command line, so I can just press Control-C to get rid of it. No, your more savvy users may unload the launch agent, so be careful. Okay. So again, you may have noticed that I've been mentioning this thing called deferrals. Nudge registers a deferral when its window isn't in active focus and the number of seconds that you've set in the current stage's refresh cycle has passed. Beware though, if the user does click the later button or unloads the launch agent or kills Nudge's process, that deferral counter will reset the next time Nudge launches. So it only exists in the session when Nudge is running. And we have a couple of different deferral types in Nudge. So the first one, which is to allow deferrals until forced secondary quit button, sets the number of deferrals that Nudge allows before it shows the secondary quit button. This only applies when Nudge is at its initial stage, where Nudge is only showing a primary quit button. So you can add some more stuff in there. The second preference, allowed deferrals, is the interesting one, and it sets the number of deferrals that Nudge will allow before it enables, and I quote, an aggressive user experience, as Eric puts it. And if you like the annoyance potential you've seen so far, I think you're going to love this, and I really think it needs a demo. So back into our profile. And we're going to make things very aggressive. So we'll set the elapsed refresh cycle to 5 seconds and nudge zone refresh cycle, which it uses all the time, to 5 seconds. Reinstall the profile. Oh, actually, before I do, I forgot to set another preference. I need to set a preference of allowed deferrals. Let's set that to 3 deferrals allowed. Okay, and let's launch it. So again, we've got the same window. I'm a user. I'm going to ignore that. I'm going to open my notes and I'm going to keep working. Watch what happens after a few seconds. And nudge has stolen focus again, and we can see the deferred count has gone to 1. I'm going to ignore that again, carry on working. We'll wait a few more seconds. So we're going to test its patience. It's now had 2 deferrals. Let's do it again. I'm going to carry on. And now we've hit 3 deferrals. So watch what happens next when we pass our deferral limit. And here is the aggressive user experience. All of your app windows are hidden, and Nudge is opening the software update preference pane. Now again, if I'm a user, I'm closing that, getting rid, carrying on. Because we've passed that number of deferrals, Nudge is going to keep hiding all my windows and opening software update system preferences. So that's really annoying for your users. Okay. And that is really Nudge in a nutshell. However, there are a few things I didn't get time to go into, such as all the different parts of the user interface that you can change. So this is really where you can add your organization's own branding and text if you want to. Nudge also supports localization, so you can change the messages in those text elements to reflect the native language that your Macs are using. And if you find the interface a little bit too busy for your liking, Nudge has a simpler UI that you can invoke as a command line option, or you can set it as a preference. And finally, Nudge will be able to push users to install major macOS upgrades in the future. But since there's no major upgrade for Big Sur just yet, we'll need to wait for that. And lastly, here is everything you need to get started with Nudge. So we've got the GitHub repo, which also has a wiki that's growing, and you can contribute to too, as well as the Nudge channel on the MacAdmins Slack. And also really make sure you check out Eric's talk that he did for Texas Apple Admins, and listen to the MacAdmins podcast episode that I've linked there if you want to learn more. And with that, I'd like to thank you all very much.
Fantastic. Thank you, Neil.
Thank you.
Okay, sounds great. So we got a couple questions here. I'm going to shoot one off at the top of the list, and then maybe Josh, you want to pick the next one to ask, and we'll ask Q&A questions here. So the first one is kind of a clarification on macOS Big Sur 11.3.4. What constitutes supervision? And to kind of tie into that, does you talked about you need the automatic device enrollment enabled? Does that include the auto advance or just any device enrollment?
So device supervision, again, it's changed a bit. So if with Catalina, a device would only be supervised if it was enrolled through automated device enrollment, if I remember rightly. With Big Sur, devices are actually supervised if they come through device enrollment. So if your users install a configuration profile to enroll as well. So it's easier to supervise devices in macOS Big Sur, and I believe it's been that way since 11.01, which was the first release. Sorry, what was the other part of that question, Rusty?
If you needed the auto advance, I think.
To my knowledge, no, you don't need the auto advance, so that doesn't affect supervision.
Fantastic.
Okay, so our next question is, can you wildcard the OS versions, or say maybe script a response that's macOS 11 or greater?
To my knowledge, no, unfortunately not. But because you've got the option to have nudges settings in a JSON file, you could programmatically update that with another process or automation. Be a lot more cleverer than anything I can do.
Oh, we have a note here that we should let people know that we're discussing the Nudge Swift and not Nudge Python,
Yes.
which is different. So if you're looking at getting Nudge and deploying your environment, Nudge Swift is built for Big Sur 10.11. Nudge Python is for older OSs. Is there a way for Nudge to become active only after software update forced defer day has passed? So, for example, you configure it for 7 days after the update to start notifying users?
I don't think there is, but as I say, other people that use Nudge a lot more may know better than that.
Okay. Is there a method utilized to update Macs on the air-gapped network that does not require direct access to Apple servers?
Again, to my knowledge, no. I think these days with the T2s and with Silicon Macs, those Macs need internet access, specifically to Apple when they update.
Great question.
They're checking sort of cryptographic signatures of the OS and things like that.
Can Nudge run with an offline policy in Jamf?
So instead of a launch agent?
Well, I suppose so, yeah. Is the preference list loaded onto the machine so Nudge can run offline, or is a connection to Jamf required?
Yeah, so you could have Nudge run offline, or if you have a launch agent, Nudge will run offline as well, and whenever a user logs in. And the beauty of a launch agent is it will rerun every half hour, or well, whatever you set the start calendar intervals to. So that's a good way of controlling Nudge offline. And your preference is, if you deploy the MDM configuration profile, once that profile's on the Mac, then it doesn't matter if the Mac's offline or online, Nudge is going to pick up its settings from that profile or a local JSON file.
How about, are there issues if the users are standard users rather than an admin?
Not that I'm aware of. As far as I know, you don't have to be an admin to click that update button in system preferences.
Okay. Another question here is, we've configured Nudge to, quote, nudge users every day at 1 p.m., which it does. Notice that if the Mac is off, then you turn it on, Nudge also comes up. Is that normal?
Really good question. I don't really know, because it depends, I guess, how you're invoking it, and if you're doing it, say, with a launch agent, that may be how launchd behaves. If it's missed the time.
That's how launchd is supposed to behave. It's supposed to trigger it the next time if it's missed it, unlike cron.
You could use a Jamf policy to run it check-in or something like that if you're triggering it with an MDM, a management tool like that. You could do it that way too.
Neil, Brian would like to know what makes the guitars are on your wall.
Oh, okay. The 12-string acoustic is a Fender. The one in the middle is a Squier, so it's a cheapo version of a Fender Strat. It's signed by a musician called Courtney Pine, who's a jazz saxophonist, who I met when I was back in college years and years ago. The one on the left, the black one, is the Yamaha, I believe it's an SA 500. So it's a clone of the Gibson E335, which is one of my favourite models.
Fantastic.
Thanks for asking that. I don't play them as much as I used to.
So interesting next question is, can you suppress Nudge from appearing if a particular program is running? Examples are, well, what you're doing right now, like presenting with PowerPoint or Keynote.
So yeah, another really good question. So I believe if you're running it from a launch agent directly, then no, and Nudge does not respect do not disturb. So that's one to bear in mind. However, you could have your launch agent trigger a script to run nudge, in theory, and that script could have some logic to say check for some open apps. So if certain apps or processes are running like Keynote or PowerPoint or something else, then it could sort of just say it won't run it at that time. So you could do it that way, but there'd be a bit of scripting involved.
Okay.
Can you suppress nudge from appearing if a particular program? Oh, I'm sorry, that was the same question. We have another question here. It says, we just ordered Jamf Pro. Do you think we will not be able to do software update with Jamf MDM?
I'd say it's not the MDM tool that affects the ability to do managed software updates. I'd say it's more of an OS issue right now. So whatever MDM you use, I think you're going to probably hit the same kind of roadblocks and challenges with it.
Okay. Let's see. So when a new OS update is released, what does your workflow look like? Do you simply bump the required minimum OS and targeted OS?
Essentially, that is what you would do.
Okay. Easy enough.
Okay. If software update deferment profile is deployed from MDM, will that prevent nudge from prompting during that time frame?
No, I don't think it will, because nudge will ignore any of that stuff. So I think what you would see happen is nudge will say that your Mac is on a lesser version than it should be, because it reads that from its own preferences. Then it launches the software update pref pane, and the software update pref pane says, no problem, you're up to date already. So it could get a bit confusing. So I guess it's really important to set your required installation dates and things like that carefully, or the required OS version carefully when you know your Macs are going to be able to see it.
All right.
Well, the last question we had was about Ben Toms having guitar and if it was a data jar job requirement to own guitars, and I already knew the answer was yes, so I took care of that. We got that Q&A sorted. But I think that is it.
Oh, we just got one more question. If nudge forces the window back up after 5 seconds, when would a user be able to save and close their work?
Well, within 5 seconds, but that's a really aggressive setting. I think I can't remember what the default is. I think it's set to 5 minutes by default for it to come back up, but I only set it to 5 seconds just to demonstrate nudge and how aggressive you could possibly make it. You could set it to 1 second if you really, really wanted to. Depends how much you like your users.
Another question, does it handle other Apple updates that appear in software update, such as Safari and security updates?
No, it's just OS versions.
Another
and then
question. What's the rest of the t-shirt?
The rest of the t-shirt. It says, it's not sarcasm, it's an allergic reaction to your stupidity. I get all my t-shirts usually as birthday or Christmas presents from my wife, so I did not choose it. She did.
Exceptional taste. I love it.
It's fantastic.
Can the user force quit nudge?
If they know how to, yes. So, do you know, that's a good question. I don't know if you can force quit from here. Let's see. Never tried this. No, it's not in the list, so you can't force quit it. But user could do a kill all and the process name, or they can unload the launch agent. So if they have access to terminal, they could do it. They could probably do it from Activity Monitor as well if they can find the process.
Okay, fantastic. We do have a couple additional questions, but we're running out of time. So we're going to take one more, and then we're going to close up for the afternoon. And I'm just looking through the last couple ones. Can you point the install button to a self-service policy instead of the software update interface?
No, unfortunately not. So it's designed to go straight to that software update preference pane, because that's really the sort of agreed best way to get updates installed on macOS at the moment. It's the safest, sort of Apple approved native way to do it.
Okay. Well, thank you again, Neil, for taking the time to deliver today's first session.
Thank you very much.